On April 27, 1865, a wooden steamboat on the Mississippi River became the site of the greatest maritime loss of life in American history, an event that claimed more lives than the sinking of the Titanic nearly half a century later. And yet, ask almost anyone today what happened to the steamboat Sultana, and you will be met with a blank stare. Not because the story is not dramatic enough, not because the loss of life was not staggering, but because of brutal, almost unbelievable timing. The Sultana's boiler failure occurred less than 2 weeks after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, at the exact moment the nation's attention was consumed by the hunt for his assassin and the final collapse of the Confederacy. More than 1,000 men, most of whom had just survived years of confinement in some of the most severe facilities of the Civil War, lost their lives in a single night on a river in Tennessee, and the country barely noticed. This is the story of how greed, compromised administration, and a single catastrophic decision turned a homecoming into an immense national misfortune, and how that story came to be almost completely forgotten. To understand how so many men ended up crowded onto one small steamboat, you have to go back to the final weeks of the Civil War and to the confinement facilities that had come to define its darkest chapters. Thousands of Union soldiers had spent months, in some cases years, held in Confederate custody, most infamously at Andersonville in Georgia and Cahaba in Alabama. These men had endured severe malnutrition, harsh illnesses, and unimaginable deprivation. As the war finally drew to a close in the spring of 1865, they were paroled and gathered at a camp near Vicksburg, Mississippi, waiting for transport that would finally carry them home to their families in the North. The United States government had a straightforward arrangement with steamboat operators for this transport. The government paid a fee for every soldier carried, calculated by the number of men and the distance traveled. For steamboat captains struggling in a difficult economy, a large contingent of returning soldiers represented an enormous financial opportunity. And this, more than any storm or any accident of nature, is where the story of the Sultana truly begins. The Sultana herself was a side-wheel steamboat, 260 feet long, built in Cincinnati in 1863 for the lower Mississippi cotton trade. She was a solid, well-regarded vessel for her time, but like virtually every steamboat of the era, she carried an inherent danger built into her very design. 4 interconnected boilers, heated by open flame, using river water that was constantly clouded with sediment and mud. Boiler failures were not a rare or unusual danger on the Mississippi in the 1860s. They were tragically a routine hazard of steam travel, one that claimed thousands of lives across the decades before the Sultana ever set out on her final voyage. On April 23, 1865, the Sultana docked at Vicksburg, and it was here that her fate, and the fate of nearly 2,000 men who had not yet even boarded her, was effectively sealed. Inspection revealed that one of her 4 boilers had developed a dangerous leak. A proper repair would have required replacing entire sheets of iron plating, a job that would take several days to complete correctly. But Captain J. Cass Mason had other priorities. Word had already reached him of the enormous contingent of paroled servicemen waiting nearby, a contract worth thousands of dollars if he could secure it for his ship alone. Time spent on a proper boiler repair was time that might allow a competing steamboat to secure that lucrative contract instead. So Mason made his choice. Rather than replace the damaged sections of the boiler, he ordered his boilermaker to simply patch the weakened plates, a temporary fix that both the boilermaker and the ship's chief engineer understood to be far less safe than what the situation truly demanded. While that hasty patch job was underway, a separate and equally consequential decision was being made on shore. Captain Mason had, according to multiple historical accounts, entered into an arrangement with an Army quartermaster named Reuben Hatch, a man with a documented history of financial misconduct. Hatch could guarantee that the Sultana, rather than any of the other steamboats docked nearby, would receive the full contingent of paroled servicemen waiting to go home, worth an estimated $2,500 to Mason, a considerable sum equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars today. In exchange, Mason would provide Hatch an illicit kickback. It was an arrangement that ensured nearly 2,000 exhausted, traumatized former prisoners of war would be loaded onto a single vessel rather than spread safely across several available ships. When military officers on the ground raised concerns about the sheer number of men being funneled onto one boat, they were overruled. One officer overseeing the transfer, fearing that other officials might be taking illicit incentives to route soldiers onto different vessels entirely, insisted that the men not be divided at all, and ordered the full contingent loaded onto the Sultana, regardless of her legal capacity. And that capacity, worth remembering clearly, was just 376 passengers and crew combined. When the Sultana finally pulled away from the Vicksburg wharf late in the evening of April 24, 1865, she carried, by most historical estimates, somewhere between 2,100 and 2,400 people. That is not double her legal limit. It is not triple. In some estimates, it is closer to 6 times the number of passengers she was ever designed to safely carry. Photographs taken during a stop in Helena, Arkansas on the morning of April 26th capture the scale of the danger in haunting detail. Every available inch of deck space on all 3 levels of the boat is packed with men, standing shoulder to shoulder with barely enough room to sit. Survivors later described conditions so cramped that soldiers had to take turns simply finding space to lie down. At one point during that stop, so many men crowded to one side of the boat, eager to be photographed, that the Sultana visibly began to tilt, and crew members had to shout for the men to redistribute their weight before the top-heavy vessel capsized right there at the dock, more than 24 hours before the event that would ultimately claim so many of their lives. The Sultana pressed on up the Mississippi, fighting against a river running dangerously high with the spring flood. In places, the water had spread more than 3 miles beyond its normal banks, submerging trees up to their highest branches. This was not simply an inconvenience. A swollen, fast-moving river placed enormous additional strain on a steamboat's engines and boilers, exactly the kind of strain that a properly repaired vessel might have withstood, but that a hastily patched one, carrying more than 5 times its intended weight, was far less equipped to handle. We share these defining, often overlooked moments of American history weekly, working to preserve the voices and lessons of our past before they are lost to time. Subscribe today to join our community of history enthusiasts and help keep these vital narratives alive. On the evening of April 26th, the Sultana reached Memphis, Tennessee, where crews spent several hours unloading over 100 tons of sugar from the ship's hold, cargo that had been carried alongside the soldiers for the entirety of the journey. Some of the men aboard took the opportunity to disembark briefly and explore the city, and a small number, exhausted and unwilling to continue the journey under such crowded conditions, chose to stay behind in Memphis rather than reboard. Near midnight, the Sultana pulled away from the city, crossed the river to take on a fresh supply of coal, and continued upriver into the darkness, carrying somewhere in the range of 2,000 men toward what they believed would be the final leg of their long journey home. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on April 27th, roughly 7 miles north of Memphis, the leaking, hastily patched boiler finally failed. The resulting explosion tore through the heart of the ship with catastrophic force, and the blast immediately triggered the failure of 2 additional boilers in a chain reaction that ripped the vessel apart from within. Survivors described the event as an instantaneous wall of fire and scalding steam, tearing through decks packed with sleeping men who had no warning and virtually nowhere to go. The ship's twin smokestacks, massive structures towering above the deck, collapsed downward directly onto the crowds of soldiers below, crushing men who had, in many cases, already survived years of confinement and extreme deprivation, only to lose their lives within sight of home. Because the Sultana was constructed almost entirely of wood and finished with oil-based paints and varnishes, the fire that followed the explosion spread with terrifying speed. Survivors later testified that within minutes, large sections of the ship were fully engulfed in flame, forcing men to make an impossible choice: remain aboard a burning vessel or leap into the frigid, floodwater currents of the Mississippi River in the middle of the night. Many of the men aboard, weakened by months or years of confinement and malnutrition, simply did not have the physical strength left to swim any meaningful distance, even for those who could swim at all. The Sultana's single lifeboat, wholly inadequate for a vessel carrying thousands, was of little use, and by several accounts was itself thrown from the upper deck during the chaos, landing on swimmers struggling in the water below and adding still further to the loss of life. For those who went into the river, survival was far from guaranteed, even after escaping the flames. The Mississippi, swollen by spring flooding, stretched in places to nearly 5 miles wide, its currents swift and littered with debris and floating wreckage from the shattered boat. Water temperatures in late April remained dangerously cold, and exposure claimed many who had successfully avoided both the fire and the initial blast. Survivors clung to whatever floated within reach: splintered timber, bales of hay, even the bodies of livestock that had been aboard the ship, drifting for hours in the darkness before rescue finally arrived from Memphis. Local residents, riverboat crews, and eventually military personnel launched a desperate rescue effort once word of the event reached the city, pulling survivors from the water for hours after the initial explosion. But for well over 1,000 men, that rescue came far too late. The exact total loss of life from the Sultana incident remains, even today, a subject of historical debate, a reflection of just how chaotic the ship's manifest and the rescue effort truly were. The official count taken in the immediate aftermath listed the number of lost lives at around 1,164. However, many historians examining hospital records, survivor testimony, and the sheer difficulty of accurately counting a vessel this catastrophically overcrowded have concluded the true toll was almost certainly higher, with credible estimates ranging as high as 1,800 lives lost in a single night. For comparison, the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, one of the most famous maritime events in world history, claimed approximately 1,500 lives. By many of the more widely cited estimates, the Sultana incident likely claimed more lives than the Titanic ever did, on a smaller boat, in a domestic river, in the middle of the night, with almost no warning at all. In the aftermath, there was, briefly, an effort to establish accountability. A military court-martial was convened in Vicksburg in November of 1865, focused on Captain Frederick Speed, the officer who had directly overseen the loading of the paroled soldiers onto the Sultana. The proceedings dragged on for 6 months, hampered significantly by the fact that several key figures involved in the original arrangement, including Quartermaster Reuben Hatch, had already resigned their military commissions and, as private civilians, were simply beyond the reach of a military court's authority. Speed was ultimately found guilty in June of 1866 and sentenced to dismissal from the Army. But that verdict was overturned soon afterward by the Army's own Judge Advocate General on the technical reasoning that while the Sultana had been overcrowded, the disaster itself had been caused by a boiler failure rather than by the ship physically capsizing under excess weight. In the end, despite illicit arrangements, despite compromised administration, despite a decision that knowingly crammed more than 5 times a vessel's legal capacity with exhausted, vulnerable soldiers, not a single person was ever meaningfully punished for the immense loss of life. Why then did an event of this scale slip so completely from public memory? The timing alone explains a great deal. The Sultana's boiler failed on April 27, 1865, a mere 12 days after Abraham Lincoln had been shot at Ford's Theater, and the very same day that Union cavalry finally tracked down the assassin, John Wilkes Booth, in a Virginia tobacco barn. Newspapers across the country, and an American public already emotionally exhausted by 4 years of devastating war, were utterly consumed by the assassination, the manhunt, and the collapse of the Confederacy, happening simultaneously across the South. A steamboat disaster on a river in Tennessee, however horrific, simply could not compete for space in the nation's newspapers or in the nation's grief. There is also a harder truth worth acknowledging. By the spring of 1865, after 4 years of a war that had already claimed hundreds of thousands of American lives, the public had grown, in a very real sense, numb to enormous casualty figures. An event that would dominate headlines for weeks in any other era was, in the spring of 1865, simply one more grim number in a season already overflowing with them. The physical evidence of the event itself would eventually vanish too, swallowed by the very river that caused it. Over the following decades, the Mississippi shifted its course multiple times, as it is prone to do, and the wreckage of the Sultana, once resting on the riverbed, ended up buried beneath dry land entirely, far from the water's current path. In 1982, an archaeological expedition led by a Memphis attorney finally located what is believed to be the remains of the Sultana, buried more than 30 feet beneath a soybean field on the Arkansas side of the river. A strange and almost poetic final resting place for a ship that had once carried so many men so close to home. Today, memorials to the Sultana and her victims stand scattered across the country, in Memphis, in Vicksburg, in Cincinnati, where she was built, and in small towns across the Midwest, where so many of the soldiers aboard had originally called home. A dedicated museum in Marion, Arkansas, now works to preserve the stories of the men who survived and the many more who did not. Descendants of survivors continue to gather periodically, determined to keep the memory of that terrible night alive, even as the broader American public remains largely unaware that it ever happened at all. What makes the story of the Sultana so quietly devastating is not simply the scale of the loss, though that scale alone is almost impossible to comprehend. It is the fact that these men had already survived the worst that the Civil War had to offer. They had endured Andersonville and Cahaba, severe malnutrition, illness, and years of captivity far from home. They had made it, against extraordinary odds, to the very last leg of their journey, boarding a steamboat with nothing left to do but travel home to the families who had waited years for their return. And in the end, it was not the war, not an enemy bullet, not illness in a confinement facility that claimed their lives. It was greed, an illicit arrangement, and a hastily patched boiler on a boat that should never have left the dock, carrying anywhere near the number of men it did. This chapter of our history deserves to be remembered. If you found this look into the true cost of the Sultana compelling, share this video with someone who loves history so you can discuss what these soldiers sacrificed for their journey home.